Sandra Bullock had just finished a long day of meetings and press interviews in downtown Los Angeles. It was one of those days that left her feeling both grateful and exhausted. Grateful because she still loved what she did, but exhausted because fame came with endless schedules, flashing cameras, and very little peace. She wasn't looking for red carpets or fancy treatment that night. All she wanted was a quiet room, a warm shower, and maybe a cup of tea before bed. The car pulled up to a luxury hotel known for its privacy and comfort. Sandra had stayed there a few times before when she needed a break from the world. The staff was usually polite, the atmosphere calm, and the rooms comfortable enough to make her forget, even for a few hours, that she was one of the most recognized faces in Hollywood. When she stepped out of the car, she wore a simple beige sweater, black jeans, and a cap pulled low. No makeup, no sunglasses, no assistant by her side this time. She liked to move quietly when she could. The night air was cool, and the soft lights of the hotel lobby glowed warmly through the glass doors. Sandra took a deep breath, thankful that the crowd of paparazzi hadn't followed her here. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of vanilla and fresh flowers. Soft jazz music played in the background, and a few guests sat by the fireplace with drinks in hand. The receptionist at the front desk was a young woman in her 20s, scrolling through her phone when Sandra approached. "Good evening," Sandra said politely, offering a gentle smile. "I have a reservation under Bullock." The receptionist didn't look up right away. Her fingers kept moving across her phone screen. When she finally lifted her eyes, she looked at Sandra for a moment, a quick glance from head to toe, then back to her computer. "Name again?" she asked flatly. "Bullock," Sandra repeated softly. "Sandra Bullock." The young woman typed something, sighed, and frowned at the monitor. "I don't see anything here for that name," she said. "Are you sure you booked at this hotel?" Sandra nodded. "Yes, my assistant made the reservation 2 days ago." "Maybe it's under her name, but it should be for me." The receptionist shrugged, still not looking at her fully. "There's nothing here, and we're fully booked tonight." Sandra hesitated, trying not to sound frustrated. "Could you please check again?" "I'm certain there's a booking. Maybe under Bullock Productions or Sandra Ann Bullock." The receptionist clicked around half-heartedly, then let out another sigh. "Like I said, there's nothing here. You can try calling back in the morning if you think there's been a mistake." Sandra looked around. The lobby wasn't crowded, and a few people had glanced over, curious about the exchange. She lowered her voice. "I've just come from a long flight and I really need a room tonight. I can pay directly if needed." The young woman crossed her arms and gave Sandra a tight smile that wasn't kind. "Ma'am, we don't accept walk-ins on weekends. Our guests usually book months in advance. This is a luxury establishment." There was something sharp in her tone, something that made Sandra feel small, not because of what she said, but how she said it. It wasn't the first time she had seen that kind of behavior. Sometimes people assumed that if she wasn't wearing designer clothes or makeup, she couldn't possibly be someone important. Still, Sandra tried to stay polite. "I understand," she said softly. "But perhaps there's a cancellation? I'd really appreciate it if you could check one more time." The receptionist sighed again, rolled her eyes, and began typing, though it was clear she wasn't trying very hard. "Look," she said after a moment. "Even if there was a cancellation, the rooms we have left are very expensive. You might want to try somewhere else. There's a motel down the street." Sandra blinked in disbelief. "A motel?" The way the young woman said it made it clear she thought Sandra couldn't afford the place. Sandra wasn't angry, more disappointed than anything. She wasn't used to being treated this way, but she also knew this was how some people behaved when they thought no one was watching. "I see," Sandra said, taking a slow breath. "Thank you for your time." She stepped back from the counter and moved toward a small seating area near the fireplace. She didn't want to cause a scene. She knew who she was, and she didn't need to prove it to anyone. All she wanted now was to think about what to do next. Maybe call her assistant or find another hotel nearby. As she sat down, she could still hear the receptionist chatting and laughing with a coworker at the desk, clearly amused about something. Sandra didn't know if it was about her, but the timing made her suspect it was. Still, she stayed calm, her expression neutral, though inside she felt a quiet sadness. For all the fame and recognition, she sometimes wished she could just move through the world like anyone else, without judgment, without assumptions. But nights like this reminded her that not everyone looked beyond appearances. A couple sitting nearby had noticed the whole exchange. The woman leaned toward her partner and whispered, "Isn't that Sandra Bullock?" The man nodded slightly, whispering back, "Yeah, it is. I can't believe that girl at the desk didn't recognize her." Sandra heard them but didn't react. She had no desire to embarrass the receptionist or use her fame to fix things. That wasn't her style. She believed in kindness even when it wasn't returned. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her messages to find her assistant's number. Maybe there was a mix-up with the reservation. As she began to type a message, she noticed movement near the entrance. Someone tall walked through the glass doors. Dressed in a dark coat and jeans, hair slightly messy, eyes calm but alert. She almost smiled. It was Keanu Reeves, but that moment hadn't come yet. For now she sat quietly, unaware that soon the entire situation would take a surprising turn. Back at the front desk, the receptionist's coworker returned from a break. "Who was that?" she asked, nodding toward Sandra's direction. "Just some lady who thought she could get a room without a reservation," the first receptionist said with a smirk. "Didn't even look like she could afford this place." Her coworker frowned. "You sure? She looks kind of familiar." The first one shrugged. "Yeah, sure she does. They all say that." She laughed lightly, shaking her head. Sandra overheard bits of the conversation and closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. She wasn't angry, not really. She'd learned long ago that people often judged what they didn't understand. What bothered her wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the lack of simple decency. A few more guests entered the lobby, chatting excitedly, dragging suitcases behind them. The receptionist immediately brightened up, flashing her best professional smile. "Welcome to the Grand Loria Hotel," she said sweetly, her voice suddenly full of charm. Sandra couldn't help but notice the shift, how quickly kindness could appear when people thought it might benefit them. She leaned back in her seat and watched quietly. The firelight reflected in her eyes, soft and warm. For a moment, she thought about the irony of it all, how people could spend their lives trying to look important while forgetting the easiest way to be important was through kindness. She didn't want to stay there anymore, even if they offered her a room now. She decided she'd call her assistant, find another place, maybe even drive home. The night was peaceful outside, and the idea of sitting quietly with a cup of tea in her kitchen sounded better than dealing with hotel drama. Sandra picked up her bag and stood. But before she could leave, a voice called out her name from across the lobby. It was soft but familiar. She turned, and there he was. Keanu Reeves, smiling that gentle, genuine smile he was known for. He looked a little tired too, like he'd had a long day. He approached her with the kind of warmth that immediately softened the room. The other guests started to murmur quietly, surprised to see two of Hollywood's most beloved stars standing together like old friends. Sandra smiled back, the tension easing from her face. "Hey," she said, her voice calm but relieved. Keanu reached out and gave her a friendly hug. "I didn't know you were staying here," he said. Sandra gave a small laugh. "I was trying to. Didn't quite work out." He frowned slightly, glancing toward the front desk. "What happened?" Sandra hesitated, not wanting to make a fuss. "Just a mix-up, I guess," she said, brushing it off. "It's fine. I'll figure it out." But Keanu could sense there was more to the story. He had known Sandra for years, long enough to recognize when she was downplaying something. The receptionist, now realizing who was standing in front of her, froze. The color drained from her face as she watched Keanu and Sandra talking. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted completely. Guests began whispering to each other, phones discreetly lifted to take pictures. The receptionist's confident posture melted into visible panic. She had no idea that the woman she'd dismissed moments ago was Sandra Bullock, or that the man who had just walked in was Keanu Reeves. And within moments, everything that happened next would leave the entire lobby silent. Keanu had just arrived at the hotel, his long day still lingering in his posture. He wasn't one to rush through anything, so when he stepped into the lobby, his pace was calm and deliberate. His eyes scanned the space briefly before landing on Sandra. There was something about her posture, something in the way she was sitting, alone, looking down at her phone. Her expression distant, that made him pause. It wasn't the first time he'd seen Sandra like this. She had a way of showing the world a smile, but keeping the weight of everything else tucked behind her eyes. He had known her long enough to know when something wasn't right, even if she didn't say a word. As he walked over to her, he noticed the receptionist looking between him and Sandra, her expression changing rapidly from casual to suddenly wide-eyed. But it wasn't until Keanu's footsteps brought him closer to Sandra that the young woman fully realized who she was staring at. "Hey," Keanu said softly as he approached, a gentle warmth in his voice. Sandra looked up, her face lighting up with a familiar smile. It wasn't the kind of smile she'd been giving the rest of the world in the past hour. It was the one she reserved for her close friends. The smile that meant everything would be okay even when things weren't. "Hey," Sandra replied, standing up as he reached her. Keanu gave her a quick hug. "You okay?" he asked, pulling back just enough to look at her. Sandra nodded, but there was something in her eyes that told him she wasn't. "Yeah, just dealing with some hotel stuff," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of frustration. "Hotel stuff?" Keanu raised an eyebrow, noticing her bag was still slung over her shoulder, her jacket still on. "You haven't even checked in yet?" She shook her head. "Nope. Apparently my reservation doesn't exist." Keanu turned to look at the receptionist, whose face had turned an awkward shade of pale. She had been pretending to be busy, but now she was caught in the realization that she had just dismissed someone who wasn't just some lady. She had been rude. She had been dismissive, and now standing before her was the one person who could make her feel like the floor had dropped out beneath her. Keanu's gaze shifted to the young woman, and he didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the receptionist freeze. Sandra noticed this too. She could tell that the receptionist was feeling the weight of her mistake, and she wasn't the type to revel in that. She didn't want to make anyone feel bad, especially when the mistake had been a simple one, born out of impatience. Sandra knew what it felt like to be in that position, to make a mistake and have everyone around you see it. She sighed softly. "Keanu, it's fine," she said, her voice kind but weary. "It's not a big deal. I'll just find another place." But Keanu, who had always been someone who stood up for what was right without making a scene, wasn't about to let this one go so easily. He had been on both sides of the Hollywood lens enough times to know that some people were treated like royalty, while others, no matter who they were treated poorly just because someone didn't recognize them. "No," Keanu said firmly, "it is a big deal." Sandra looked at him, about to protest, but he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Let me talk to the manager. This is just wrong." For a moment, Sandra was speechless. She hadn't expected him to jump in the way he did. She knew he was a good person, but this felt different. The way he stood up for people, no matter who they were, that was something she admired about him. The receptionist had by now recovered from her initial shock, and her smile, although strained, returned as she reached for the phone. "I'll get the manager," she said quickly, her voice noticeably less confident than before. As the receptionist dialed, Keanu turned back to Sandra. He didn't need to ask how she was feeling. Her body language said it all. Sandra was someone who carried the weight of her own silence. When people spoke to her, they often saw the confident actress, the woman who had overcome so much. But underneath it all, there was the person who had been learning how to handle people's assumptions for years. It wasn't always easy, but she kept going. "I'm sorry about all this," Keanu said quietly, his eyes soft with empathy. Sandra shook her head. "Don't be sorry," she replied, her voice light. "I'm not the one who made a mistake here." Keanu offered a small, reassuring smile. He could see she wasn't angry, just tired. She had probably experienced this kind of treatment before, only without the benefit of someone stepping in. He could only imagine what it must feel like to be on the receiving end of that kind of dismissal, when all you wanted was to be treated like anyone else. A few moments later, the manager arrived, his steps hurried but controlled. The man was in his mid-40s, his suit sharp and well-tailored, his hair neatly combed. He looked from Sandra to Keanu, and then back at the receptionist, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "What seems to be the problem?" the manager asked, his tone polite but with an edge of concern. Sandra took a deep breath. She didn't want to cause a scene, but she also wasn't about to pretend like what had just happened was okay. "I'm Sandra Bullock," she said simply, meeting his eyes directly. "And I have a reservation that I was told didn't exist." The manager blinked and his eyes shifted to the receptionist, who was now visibly sweating. "Is this true?" he asked her. though his voice was more questioning than accusing. The receptionist, her face flushed, nodded quickly. I didn't realize who she was. I thought she was just another guest. I didn't mean to. Before she could finish, the manager raised his hand, signaling for her to stop. I see. I will take care of this. Sandra glanced at Keanu, who was watching the interaction carefully. He gave her a small nod as if to say, "It's going to be okay." And it was. In that moment, she could see how much Keanu's quiet confidence made a difference. The manager quickly turned back to Sandra, his tone shifting to one of full politeness and respect. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, Ms. Bullock. If you would allow me, I'll personally make sure your reservation is honored. We value all of our guests here, and clearly we've failed in this instance." Sandra gave a small smile, but her eyes showed she wasn't fully satisfied yet. She didn't want to be treated like a VIP because of her fame. She just wanted basic human respect. "That was all. Thank you," she said, her voice calm but with a firm undertone. "But it's not just about the reservation. It's about how I was treated. I don't expect special treatment. I expect courtesy. Everyone deserves that." The manager nodded quickly, clearly aware that he was on thin ice. "Of course, Ms. Bullock, you're absolutely right. We'll address this immediately and make sure this doesn't happen again." Keanu stood there, arms folded across his chest, watching the scene unfold. His gaze never wavered from the manager, and his quiet support was palpable. Sandra had handled everything with grace. But Keanu wasn't going to let the situation slide without ensuring the staff learned a valuable lesson. The manager gave a final bow of his head, clearly chastened. "Please allow me to escort you to your room. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to call." Sandra, still feeling the weight of the moment, nodded. She didn't need to say anything more. The message had been sent. As the manager walked her to the elevator, Keanu stayed behind for a moment, watching them go. When Sandra was out of earshot, he turned back to the receptionist, his gaze sharp yet calm. "Remember," Keanu said quietly, but with a firm tone, "you never know who you're dealing with, and no one should be treated like that, no matter who they are." The receptionist nodded, her face a mixture of embarrassment and understanding. She had learned a lesson she wouldn't forget any time soon. Keanu's eyes softened, and he turned toward the elevator, ready to follow Sandra. She had handled everything with quiet dignity, and now it was his turn to make sure she felt safe and respected. They were both people who deserved to be treated kindly, no matter what their names were. As the elevator doors closed behind them, Sandra let out a long, quiet sigh. She didn't want to make a big deal out of what had just happened. She'd been in this world long enough to know that moments like these, though frustrating, were unfortunately not rare, but tonight felt different. The exhaustion from her busy schedule seemed to weigh even heavier now, compounded by the unpleasant experience she'd just had. Keanu stood beside her, his eyes soft and understanding, but not overbearing. He wasn't the type to ask questions that would make her feel more exposed. He knew she'd talk when she was ready, and he wasn't going to rush her. The elevator hummed as it made its way up. The ride felt too long, as if the world outside had paused, waiting for something to shift. Sandra glanced at Keanu, catching his eyes for a brief second before she looked away again. She was trying not to let herself feel too much, trying to keep it all in. "Thanks," Sandra said finally, breaking the silence. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he smiled at her, a quiet but genuine smile, the kind that only someone who truly understood would give. It wasn't a smile of pity or of a desire to fix things. It was just a simple acknowledgement of her gratitude, of her strength. "No need to thank me," Keanu replied softly. "I'm just glad I could help." "But you didn't deserve any of that." Sandra nodded, her eyes tracing the floor of the elevator, the metallic reflection of her shoes catching her attention. She had always prided herself on handling things with grace. But there was something about tonight that felt different. Something about being so casually dismissed, especially in front of people who didn't know her, bothered her more than she expected. The elevator finally came to a stop, and the doors slid open to reveal a quiet, dimly lit hallway. It was a world away from the bustle of the lobby and the sharp tension of the front desk. Sandra took a few steps out of the elevator and looked around. She was used to luxury hotels, of course, the rooms, the amenities, the polished wood and soft lighting, but tonight, It all seemed a bit hollow. Keanu followed her out, matching her pace, his hand in his coat pocket as he observed her carefully. He didn't rush her, allowing her space. As they walked toward her room, Sandra's mind wandered back to the moment she'd sat down in that lobby, feeling like an invisible person. She was so used to being seen, so used to being recognized, that moments like these, when she was reduced to just another face in the crowd, were harder than she liked to admit. She could have easily gone somewhere else, found another place to stay, but something about the whole situation stuck with her. It wasn't just the receptionist. It wasn't even the lack of recognition. It was the attitude. The way people sometimes believed they could treat others based on assumptions or appearances. She knew it happened to others, of course, but tonight it had happened to her. And even though it wasn't the end of the world, it still stung. As they arrived at her room, Keanu reached for the door handle, but before opening it, he turned to Sandra. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Sandra paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the question. He wasn't just asking if she was physically fine. He was asking about how she felt, how she was holding up. She appreciated that. "Yeah," Sandra answered finally, her voice steady. "I will be. It's just, sometimes it's hard, you know. You think you're just going to get through the day, but then something like this happens and it just hits different." Keanu nodded in understanding. "I get it. It's not about the hotel or the reservation or any of that. It's about how we're treated, how we're seen, and sometimes people forget that." Sandra smiled faintly. "Exactly." She stepped into her room and tossed her bag on the bed. The space was quiet, with soft lighting casting a warm glow across the room. It was the kind of room designed for rest and relaxation, yet all Sandra felt was a quiet disconnection. Keanu followed her in, not crowding her but standing near the door, giving her the space she needed. She sat on the edge of the bed, removing her shoes and rubbing her tired feet. "You know," Sandra said after a moment, "I've spent so many years trying to be as low-key as possible. I don't like the fuss, the attention, but even when you don't want it, people still make assumptions." Keanu leaned against the wall, his gaze thoughtful. "It's tough. People think that just because they know your face, they know who you are. But there's so much more to you, to everyone, than what's on the surface." Sandra glanced up at him. "And yet all it takes is a second for someone to decide you don't matter." Keanu shook his head slowly. "Don't let them decide that for you." Sandra smiled softly at that. "It's not that simple, is it?" she replied with a half laugh. "It's hard not to let it get to you when it happens over and over." "I know," Keanu said, his voice quiet but certain. "But the thing is, they don't get to define you." "You do." Sandra leaned back on the bed, closing her eyes for a moment. She didn't answer right away, but his words stayed with her. They were simple, but they hit hard in the best way. She knew that at the end of the day, it wasn't the world that defined her. It was how she carried herself, how she responded to the world that mattered. But sometimes, even the strongest of us needed a reminder. The room was silent for a few moments, save for the sound of soft breathing. Sandra felt herself beginning to relax, her tension melting away just a little. There was something about Keanu's presence that made things feel less complicated. He wasn't the type to make a big scene, but when he spoke, people listened. It wasn't just because of his fame, and it was because he had a way of making people feel heard. He understood. That's what mattered. "So," Sandra said, breaking the silence, "how about we just forget about tonight and grab some food?" "I'm starving," Keanu grinned. "Now that's an idea I can get behind." Sandra stood up, stretching as she looked around for the room service menu. "Do you want pizza, or should we be more grown up and go for something healthy?" Keanu chuckled. "Pizza. Definitely pizza." Sandra laughed, the tension she'd been holding finally starting to slip away. "I like your style," she said, grabbing the menu. They spent the next few minutes chatting about nothing in particular. Movies, books, the random things that come up when you're trying to push aside something that still lingers in your mind. And for the first time that evening, Sandra felt like she was just herself again. Keanu's calm presence made all the difference. He didn't push her to talk about anything she wasn't ready to talk about. He just let her be. That's the thing about true friends. They don't make you feel like you owe them anything. They're just there, standing by you in a way that makes the hard moments a little easier to bear. Sandra placed the order for pizza, and they both sank into the chairs, the weight of the day finally beginning to lift. The world outside could wait. Tonight it was just them. Two friends sharing a quiet moment in a room far from the chaos of their everyday lives. And for the first time in a while, Sandra felt like she could breathe. The evening had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The pizza had arrived, and with it the usual ease of an impromptu late-night meal between two friends. The two of them had settled into the deep, oversized chairs in the hotel room, each with a slice of pizza in hand. The world outside, with its endless pressures and judgments, felt like it belonged to another time and place. Tonight it was just about them. Sandra took a bite of her pizza, savoring the familiar taste. She hadn't realized how hungry she'd been, not just for food, but for something to settle her nerves. The crazy mix of emotions from earlier had taken a toll on her, but now there was just a quiet sense of calm between them. She could hear Keanu's laughter as they joked about the most trivial things, but for once it didn't feel forced. They didn't need to fill the silence with anything profound. Being together, sharing this simple moment was enough. Who knew a pizza could make everything feel right again? Sandra said, her voice light as she leaned back in the chair, her feet up on the small table in front of her. Keanu grinned, taking a bite of his own slice. Pizza does have that magical power, he said, his voice playful. It's like the great equalizer. No matter how bad your day is, a slice of pizza makes everything better. Sandra laughed, shaking her head. If only the world worked like that. Imagine if we could all just sit down with a pizza and forget everything for a while. Keanu paused for a moment, looking at her thoughtfully. Maybe we don't need to forget. Maybe we just need to take a moment to breathe. The rest can wait. Sandra raised an eyebrow at him. Since when did you become such a philosopher? He chuckled. I'm just saying. We get so caught up in the hustle, the expectations, the noise. Sometimes we just need to step back, enjoy the little things, and remind ourselves that we don't have to have it all figured out. Sandra looked at him, her gaze softening. There was something about his simplicity, his way of making things feel less complicated, that she found reassuring. It wasn't that Keanu had all the answers, but he had a way of making her feel like she could get through anything, even the toughest days. I wish I could be more like you sometimes, she said quietly, her words almost drifting away as she spoke them. Keanu looked at her with a knowing smile. I'm not perfect, Sandra. Believe me, but we all have our own way of handling things. The key is to not let the world convince you that your way isn't good enough. Sandra nodded, feeling a small weight lift off her chest. She had spent so many years trying to live up to the image that others had of her, trying to make sure she was always in control, always composed. But in the quiet moments like this, when there was no spotlight and no expectations, she felt free. I guess I just get tired sometimes, Sandra said, her voice soft, vulnerable. I try to balance everything, but I'm not always sure I'm doing it right. Sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions. Keanu's expression softened. He set his pizza down and leaned forward slightly. It's okay to be tired, you know. It's okay to not have everything figured out. You don't always have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. Sandra gave him a small smile. I know, I've always been the one people turn to for answers. I guess it's hard to admit when you don't have them yourself. Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes understanding. That's the thing about being human. We all have our moments of doubt. We all have times when we don't know what comes next. But it doesn't make you any less strong or capable. It just makes you real. Sandra's gaze drifted toward the window, her mind wandering for a moment. She could see the city lights in the distance, flickering like tiny stars against the dark sky. The world felt so vast, so unpredictable, and yet, here she was in this quiet hotel room with a good friend sharing a meal, just trying to find her way through it all. I used to think I had to have it all together, she said quietly, almost to herself. Like if I just worked hard enough, did everything right, then maybe I'd be perfect. But the older I get, the more I realize that's not how it works. Keanu smiled gently, his voice calm but firm. Perfection is a myth. It doesn't exist. It's the flaws, the messiness, the mistakes. That's what makes us human. And that's what makes us who we are. Sandra let his words settle in. It wasn't like she hadn't heard them before. People had told her similar things over the years. But there was something different about hearing it from Keanu. His words felt like a warm embrace, not just a reminder of what she already knew. It felt like permission to stop trying to be perfect and just be herself. I think I needed to hear that, she said softly, looking at him again. I've been so focused on the idea of doing it all that I forgot it's okay to just be. Keanu gave a slight nod. Exactly. Life's not a checklist. It's not about ticking boxes. It's about being present in each moment, however messy or imperfect it may be, and you're doing just fine. Sandra smiled, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't realized she'd been holding on to. There was something about Keanu's easygoing nature that made everything feel more manageable. Maybe it was his ability to see beyond the surface, to recognize that everyone, no matter how successful or famous, had their struggles. He didn't treat her like she was any different than anyone else, and that was one of the things she appreciated most. After a long pause, Sandra broke the silence. Do you ever get tired of it?
The attention, I mean.
The way people look at you like you're someone they know even when they don't. Keanu thought for a moment before responding. I don't think I get tired of the attention, really. It's more about the expectations. People have this idea of who I am, but they only see the version of me they want to see. It's a strange thing living in the spotlight, but at the end of the day, I know who I am. I've spent enough time with myself to figure that out. Sandra nodded, considering his words. It was true. People often saw only the part of you they wanted to see, the public you. But there was so much more beneath the surface, so much more to anyone than what they showed the world. You know, Sandra said, a smile tugging at her lips, you're not so bad at this whole being real thing yourself. Keanu grinned. I try my best. The evening carried on like this. Light conversation, shared jokes, a sense of normalcy that felt like a rare gift in the whirlwind of their lives. They didn't talk about work, or the pressures of their careers, or anything that reminded them of the chaos they both often lived in. Instead, they focused on each other, sharing little moments that made the world outside seem less important. As the night grew later, Sandra felt the familiar weight of sleep beginning to settle over her. She hadn't realized how much she needed this time, just to be herself, without the expectations, without the cameras, without the world watching. Thanks, Keanu, she said softly as she stood up to gather the empty pizza boxes. For everything. You really know how to make things feel better. Keanu smiled, standing up as well. It's nothing. Just here for you. Sandra paused for a moment, looking at him with gratitude in her eyes. It wasn't just the pizza or the conversation. It was the feeling of being understood, of having someone who didn't expect anything from her other than her company. You really are a good friend, she said, her voice warm. Keanu gave a small, humble shrug. Just doing what friends do. As the night finally began to wind down, Sandra felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure what the next day would bring or the next challenge, but for now, in this moment, she was okay. She was enough, just as she was, and that was enough to make her smile. The night felt peaceful, but Sandra knew it wouldn't last forever. The weight of the world was always there, just hovering around the edges of her mind, ready to pull her back into the swirl of expectations, the long list of things to do, and the constant demands. But for now, she allowed herself to simply breathe. She allowed herself to enjoy this moment of quiet before everything ramped up again. She glanced over at Keanu, who was now looking out the window, his arms casually crossed. The soft glow of the city lights reflected in his eyes, adding an almost surreal quality to the quiet of the room. Sandra had always admired the way he moved through life. It wasn't that he had it all figured out. No one did. But there was a certain peace in the way he handled things. Even the toughest moments, you know, Sandra began, her voice breaking the silence. I think I'm starting to realize something. It's not about having control over everything. It's about knowing when to let go. Keanu turned his head slightly as though considering her words before giving her a soft smile. That's the hardest part, isn't it? Letting go. We spend so much time trying to hold everything together that we forget it's okay to just release some things. Sandra chuckled lightly. Yeah, I guess I've spent most of my life trying to keep it all perfect. But perfect is impossible, isn't it? Absolutely. Perfection doesn't exist. It's just an illusion. Keanu's tone was thoughtful. He knew the pressures Sandra faced, even if he didn't always understand the weight of them. But in this moment, it didn't matter. They were just two people sharing a quiet night, finding some solace in each other's company. She looked out at the city beyond the window, thinking about the constant noise and energy that filled the streets below. It was easy to get lost in it, to feel like you had to be a part of it. But sometimes she wished she could step away from it all just for a little while, a chance to be truly free, It's funny, Sandra continued, her thoughts spilling out in the quiet of the room. I love my job and I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had. But sometimes I wish I could just disappear for a bit. No cameras. No red carpets, just me. I think I'd like that more than I let myself admit. Keanu nodded in understanding. I get that. The pressure of always being on, always being what others expect of you can be exhausting. It takes away from who you really are sometimes, but it's important to remember that you're allowed to step back, to take that space when you need it. Sandra turned to him, feeling a new sense of clarity. She had spent so much of her life trying to fit into a box that everyone else had built for her. She had been living in the spotlight for so long that she'd forgotten the value of stepping back, of simply being her true self, without the layers of expectation and performance. It wasn't about running away from her career or her public image. It was about finding a balance. I guess I need to be better about doing that, Sandra said softly, just allowing myself to be, without constantly worrying about what others think. Keanu smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. We all do. It's easy to get caught up in the expectations of others, but the most important thing is to stay true to yourself, to find those moments where you can just be, even if it's only for a little while. Sandra looked down at the empty pizza box on the table and chuckled. Well, if nothing else, at least we're both really good at making bad decisions when it comes to food. Keanu laughed, shaking his head. Hey, bad decisions are part of being human. Besides, I'm not complaining about the pizza. It's a solid choice. Sandra laughed again, the sound more natural this time without the weight of the earlier tension in her voice. She needed this. The light-hearted moments that reminded her of the simple pleasures in life, the ones that didn't come with a price tag or the weight of expectation. I guess there's a lot of wisdom in being able to enjoy the small things, she said, looking back at him, like pizza or even just sitting here talking. I always forget how much those things matter until I actually take the time to appreciate them. Keanu nodded, looking down at his empty plate. It's easy to forget, but it's in the little moments that we find the most peace. They don't come with any pressure. No cameras. No agendas. Sandra felt a small shift inside her. Maybe it wasn't about escaping her life or running away from her responsibilities. Maybe it was about finding a way to embrace those small moments. Those moments of simplicity that could bring back a sense of balance. After a long pause, Keanu stood up and stretched, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled in the room. I don't know about you, but I'm about ready for a change of scenery. I don't think I can sit in this room much longer. Sandra laughed, standing up with him. I know what you mean. After a day like today, I think I need some fresh air. The two of them left the room and wandered out into the hallway, stepping into the night. The cool evening air felt refreshing against Sandra's skin. It wasn't the kind of moment that would be featured in a magazine or a movie, but that was exactly what she needed. Just a simple walk with no agenda, no script, just the quiet hum of the city around them and the comfort of good company. As they walked side by side, Sandra realized how rare these moments were. The times when she could just be herself, without the noise of the world pulling at her. The times when she could let go of all the expectations just for a while and simply exist. You ever feel like you're just floating through life sometimes? Sandra asked, her voice thoughtful. Keanu thought for a moment before replying. I think we all feel like that from time to time. Like we're being carried along but not really in control. But I've also learned that sometimes you just have to let it happen. We can't control everything, and that's okay. The key is finding your footing when the world feels a little unsteady. Sandra smiled at his words, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. Maybe she didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe it wasn't about always being in control. It was about taking the time to appreciate the moments of calm and clarity that came along. No matter how brief, they continued walking, the cool night air lifting their spirits as they moved through the quiet streets. For once, Sandra wasn't thinking about what was next. She wasn't worrying about the next interview or the next film. She was simply present in the here and now, appreciating the quiet companionship of a friend who understood exactly what she needed. And that, for now, was enough.